weren't just couriers, they weren't just messengers. Many of them ended up commanding their own units, basically. And ultimately, over time, they were given much more extensive training. They were also trained to parachute. The way to get people in behind enemy lines was to drop them.
All right, so these are probably the first female, I suppose we could call them paratroopers that are trained.
Oh, yeah, no, they're the first female combat paratroopers, without question.
Right. What's this like then? So after the first class is graduated, are they almost immediately dropped into Vichy, France? And could you walk me through the process of you graduate from your training, you get on the plane, you pack your parachute. So what happens after you land and you hit the ground?
So the first two women infiltrated by parachute are actually the two women who I focus on, two of the three women I focus on in my book from the first class. Andrée Borrel was 22 when she was dropped behind enemy lines, and she is the very first combat paratrooper by about 3 seconds. The second is a woman named Lise de Baissac, and Andrée had already worked on the French Underground Railroad, escaped to London, and got sent back in. The Underground Railroad being getting pilots out of France back to the Allies. So Andrée goes to Paris, where she will be part of setting up all of the northern networks for SOE in France. So Paris is going to be the communication hub for the French resistance. We know at this point, it's pretty obvious just looking at a map, when the Allies come, they're going to come across the Channel. They're going to invade France on its northern coast. We don't know where. Andrée was in charge of making sure there were resistant networks all along the French coastline, so that when the Allies came back, there were resistance units there waiting for them. Lise de Baissac was parachuted in. She immediately went south to Poitiers, which is a sort of kind of middle-of-the-nowhere university church town, but close to the demarcation line, which is where Vichy France at the time and German-occupied France were divided. And her job was to help get agents across the line and to receive agents and get them clothing and tickets and contacts so that they could set up networks elsewhere along the demarcation line. They were infiltrated in September 1942, and by November 1942, Hitler invades all of France. And it's not that the demarcation line isn't important after that, but it certainly doesn't have the same level politically that it did. So Lise is supposed to just kind of be a liaison agent, and she finds it utterly boring. Just nothing happens between drops. And so she starts to set up her own network. She's effectively begins running her own network. She also takes classes in typing and Spanish because she's so bored. And that's Lise's first mission, she was sent as a liaison agent. She ends up running her own unit. Andrée's first mission is to Paris. Unfortunately, Andrée, after about 8 months, is captured. But all of the networks that were successful on D-Day can sort of reach back to the original moments where Andrée was there setting up those networks. She seeded the whole north of France, or helped seed.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. I'm really curious, how on earth do you set up a resistance cell? I'm ignorant in this topic, so I imagine sitting next to someone on a park bench and speaking in code. The sparrow flies at midnight, or say...
that's not wrong. You're meeting in people's living rooms. You sort of know who the dissidents are. You try and find people who are secure, who aren't going to sell you out to the Nazis, who aren't stupid and just going to make dumb mistakes. And it's a kind of whisper network. France was against Germany before they were for them. There were still a lot of people who fought in the Blitzkrieg who were pissed and wanted France to be free. It wasn't impossible to find people, though it was quite hard.
Yeah, and I'd love to dig into the mechanics of setting up resistance cells. One other thing, too, another focus of your book is on Odette Sansom, if I've not completely mispronounced that. Does she come in early in the war as well, or is she on a later drop?
So actually, during her parachute training, she gets a concussion and cannot be dropped by parachute after that. They decide that she has to be infiltrated by sea into what was then Vichy France. So she goes the long way around through Gibraltar and past Spain into southern France. She lands near Cassis. And she's not a super successful agent as such. She doesn't really accomplish much by way of recruitment or receiving goods or even liaison. She's captured early on. But the moment she's captured, she becomes very useful. First of all, she does this thing that I found utterly fascinating, and that is she manages to sort of she saves her commanding officer's life with a lie. And it's a very feminine lie. The moment she's captured by Nazis, she says, her commanding officer, whose name is Peter Churchill, she says, he's Winston Churchill's nephew. He was not Winston Churchill's nephew, but she says it anyway. And then she says, and I'm his wife. And in that moment goes from being a spy who Hitler has already given orders that all spies are supposed to be basically disappeared, tortured, removed. Worst of Nazi cruelty will be enacted on them and they will never be seen or heard from again. She goes from being under those orders, the commando orders, to being a high-value diplomatic prisoner. Saves her commanding officer's life, saves her own life, and also saves the radio officer's life in that moment with that lie. Because she is a VIP, she doesn't suffer the same fate as the other agents who were captured. The female agents who are captured, 13 of them die. Male agents who are captured overwhelmingly die. Very few make it back. But she does because she's a VIP, and she was her last year in captivity was in Ravensbrück, which is the largest women's prison in history. And she escapes at the end of the war, and she escapes with evidence that will put the commandant of Ravensbrück behind bars and condemn him to death. So one of the worst Nazi war criminals, there were so many, but she gets one of the worst. She is part of the trial that condemns him to death with evidence she got by surviving, by escaping. So not much of a spy under ordinary orders, but making it to the end of the war, she really helped, change the world.
One other bit on Odette Sansom's background, I read just briefly about her, and she was a mother of three. How does...
she was a mother of three.
Right, and just from a small town area. So what caused her to join this organization?
This is a hard one. This is sort of what got me interested in Odette's story in particular is I can't imagine leaving three babies behind, right? I mean, very little girls. These aren't three adult daughters. These are daughters. She has a daughter under the age of 6. So, but she frames the question about whether or not to go in, again, like a kind of feminine language, in the language of motherhood. She says, okay, Europe's gone. There's no democracy left in Europe. All of Europe belongs to the fascists. And Britain is last hope. Britain is the last hope island. This is the last democracy in Europe. What happens to my little girls if Hitler gets Britain too? Like, shouldn't I as a mother do everything possible, make any sacrifice so that my girls can grow up under a democratic flag? And that is what makes her leave. That framing is how she convinces herself it's okay to go. And she puts her kids in boarding school and she leaves them. And she won't see them again for over 3 years.
Okay, so she's in France continuously from when she drops till the end of the war?
She's in France from 1942 to 1944. After D-Day, then the Nazis basically transfer all the captured agents to concentration camps. So she ends up in Ravensbrück for a year.
Okay. Well, I'd love to hear how amongst the SOE members, once they land in France, we mentioned they talk with those who are sympathetic to the French resistance. What does it look like to set up a resistance cell of training them, arming them, getting them into communication? How often do you have meetings with them? What does the liaison network look like? I'm really fascinated how this all looks.
So one of the important things to realize is you're not recruiting the best soldiers in France. You're recruiting the worst soldiers in France. The best soldiers in France are in jail. The second best soldiers in France are working in war factories. You're recruiting old men and teenagers. You're recruiting on the margins of France. You're recruiting the people who are sort of taking care of an entire household of, say, 10 women in a family farm. And you're asking them to leave their family farm and go live in the hills, live badly in the hills. You're basically camping, and get trained as a guerrilla with weapons, with, answering to commands, orders, learning how to blow up a train, learning how to take down power lines. And you don't know that you will win. You don't know that you're going to be useful. If you are captured doing this, you will 100% definitely be get the worst of Nazi cruelty. And so it's very hard to recruit. It turns out women were pretty exceptionally good at this, but also better than men in some ways, because they're born listeners. They're born caretakers, right? They are, if not born, they are very early acculturated to doing this kind of caretaking work, listening to the concerns of someone else. The men on the ground had to learn this skill, and they did. So a lot of what you're doing by way of recruitment is cajolement. Once they're in the hills, you're training them as any guerrilla army would. And again, you're not getting the best soldiers, you're getting the worst soldiers. You're doing it on supplies that are dropped from the sky, and they are dropped irregularly. And you're waiting for a day that may or may not come. I mean, and there was reason to be very discouraged about it, because France really expected D-Day would arrive in the summer of 1943. It was a total shock when the first arrival of troops goes to Sicily instead. All the people training up until that point thought it was a kind of short-term endeavor. They didn't think they had another year left. But they did. So it was very much a kind of fool's errand. There was no reason to believe it would work. Once you were there, you're getting paramilitary training with scant resources. And that said, they were incredibly effective. That Eisenhower at the end of the war said that these resistance troops, probably shortened the war by 6 months because of things like that 3-week delay of Hitler's tanks getting to the beaches. Also, say on D-Day, the French resistance took out underground telecoms cables and telephone wires. And by doing so, they forced the Nazis to broadcast their troop movements. At that point, we had absolutely already decrypted Enigma, so we could anticipate where they were going. The French resistance were, so part of what you're learning is not just how to blow up a train, but why taking out these underground wire cables matter, and doing it on this day, and why that is important to the overall war plans.
Yeah, one other thing, too, with those who are recruited, who are not the ideal soldiers, they're in the third tier of people that you would want to be recruited. In a way, it sort of fits the mold of the SOE soldiers themselves, where the Nazis wouldn't suspect a female network of spies, and the people who are recruited maybe wouldn't fit the mold either. Tell me if this lines up with what you research, and if it doesn't, I'm happy to know either way, but it seems like the people who did really well at spycraft, they're not the sexy, dashing James Bond type. Well, maybe like Dusko Popov could sort of fit that mold.
Right.
He's sort of like the real-life James Bond. Topic for another day, but a lot of times spies are just boring people that you want to ignore. And not just spies, but people who seem to know what's going on are the people that everyone ignores, but overhear things because everyone ignores them, like the butler or the guy in the cloakroom, or even in the past, slaves would be part of spy rings because everyone just ignored them and treated them like wallpaper. Was there sort of an element of that where people could get away with things, or maybe they got by close scrapes because they didn't fit what Nazi soldiers would think of as being part of a resistance cell?
I mean, absolutely. There was a basic kind of chauvinism all over Europe, but certainly within Nazi high command. No one expected a girl on a bicycle might have explosives in her bicycle basket. There were so many girls on bicycles in France. So yes, you're looking for people who aren't going to stand out. James Bond stands out all too much, but it's worth saying.
He uses his real name on missions. That's not a good strategy.
But, Ian Fleming was an intelligence officer during World War II for the Navy, and he absolutely knew about SOE. And in fact, Miss Moneypenny is believed to be based on Vera Atkins, who was kind of the center of SOE in France. She was second in command there, but considered the brains of the operation. So he was working off the model of SOE when he came up with his high-flying and dashing James Bond.
Well, I'm really curious about the commando raids and other things that the SOE gets involved with. What are some of the things they do before D-Day or D-Day Eve to help out with the French underground and slow things down for the Nazis? And you mentioned doing things to help track German troop movements.
So strategy changes over time, as it should in any war. When the women are dropped in 1942, there's a very distinct difference in strategy between Vichy France, and occupied France. In occupied France, they called it, the strategy was bangs. We would blow stuff up. We would try and